Please, Julian, you don't understand. People are going to die because of these falsified reports, Dr. Sarah Miller whispered, her voice trembling as she backed away into the dimly lit corridor of the restricted records wing. Her breath hitched in the freezing air of the hospital's ventilation system, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant howl of the Chicago wind battering the glass panes of St. Jude's Memorial. She wasn't just a doctor in that moment. She was a woman realizing that the man standing in front of her didn't view patients as people, but as obstacles to his own perfection. What happened next would set a chain of events into motion that would tear the very foundations of the city's elite apart, revealing a secret buried under 20 years of silence and grey slush. This is a story about the shadows we cast and the price of a second chance. I need you to stay with me until the very end, because the man you are about to meet is not who he seems. After you've heard his journey, please leave a comment with a rating from 0 to 10 for this story. And if this narrative moves you, subscribe to the channel to support my work. I truly count on your presence here every day. The city of Chicago in late November is a graveyard. It is a place of biting winds and jagged skylines that look like teeth ready to swallow anyone too weak to fight back. Inside the walls of St. Jude's Memorial, the atmosphere is no warmer. The floors are polished to such a high mirror shine that you can see the rigid hierarchy of the medical world reflected in the tile. At the top are the surgeons, the gods in white coats who walk with the weight of the world on their shoulders. At the very bottom, invisible and silent, is Elias Thorne. To the rest of the world, Elias is a ghost in a navy blue jumpsuit. He is 60 years old, moves with a slight persistent limp, and never looks anyone in the eye. He is the man who pushes the mop, the man who cleans up the coffee spills in the waiting room and the blood in the emergency bays. He is part of the furniture, as unremarkable as a fire extinguisher or a plastic chair. But Elias carries a weight that no one in that hospital could possibly comprehend. Deep in his pocket, his fingers often brush against a small tarnished silver medal of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes. It is a reminder of a life he tried to bury 2 decades ago. Back then, he wasn't Elias. He was known in the smoke-filled backrooms of Cicero as the architect. He was the man who ran the logistics for the Chicago outfit, a man who moved millions of dollars and thousands of lives with a cold, mathematical precision. He didn't use a gun. He used his mind, and that made him the most dangerous man in the city. He left it all behind when the life he built collapsed on top of the one person he loved. A botched hit, meant for someone else, took the life of his only daughter. The grief didn't just break him, it erased him. He made a deal with the shadows, a vow of silence and penance. He would disappear, live a life of invisibility, and never again raise his hand in violence. He wore long sleeves even in the sweltering heat of the boiler rooms to hide the faded ink on his forearms, symbols of a brotherhood he had betrayed by simply surviving. For 20 years, he had been a shadow. Until Sarah Miller. Sarah was a first-year pediatric resident, a girl from the South Side who still believed that medicine was a calling rather than a business. She was the only person in the entire hospital who treated Elias like a human being. At 4 a.m., during the quietest, coldest hour of the night, she would bring him a cup of coffee. She would ask about his bum leg and tell him about a young boy named Leo, a foster kid with a failing heart and no insurance, whose case the administration was trying to sweep under the rug. To Elias, Sarah was a flicker of light in a very dark world. She reminded him of the daughter he couldn't save, fierce, idealistic, and dangerously brave. The storm that hit Chicago that Tuesday night was a monster. The city was paralyzed under a layer of ice, and St. Jude's was running on a skeleton crew. The halls were quiet, save for the hum of the machines and the rhythmic shush-shush of Elias's mop. He was working the late shift near the restricted records wing, a place he usually avoided. But fate has a way of finding you, no matter how deep you bury yourself. Julian Vane was also there that night. Julian was the prince of St. Jude's, a 30-year-old surgical resident with the temperament of a predator. He was the son of Arthur Vane, the hospital director, a man whose political connections were as thick as his wallet. Julian moved through the halls with an entitlement that turned the air sour. He viewed the hospital as his personal playground, protected by his father's power and a private security force that acted more like a Praetorian guard than a safety team. In a secluded hallway, away from the prying eyes of the security cameras that Arthur Vane had conveniently serviced earlier that day, Sarah confronted Julian. She had found the discrepancies in his surgical reports. She had seen the names of the patients who had died under his care, mistakes covered up by forged signatures and altered vitals. She wasn't just angry. She was a threat to the Vane legacy. "You're going to the board, Sarah. Really?" Julian's voice was a low, dangerous silk. He stepped closer to her, his face twisting into something that no longer looked like a doctor. "You're a nobody from the slums. My father owns this city. You think anyone will listen to a girl who can barely pay her student loans?" "I don't care who your father is, Julian," Sarah snapped, her voice cracking but her eyes holding steady. "Leo deserves a chance, and these families deserve the truth. I've already made copies of the files." That was the moment the mask slipped. Julian didn't argue. He didn't debate. He snapped. Fueled by a cocktail of stimulants and the arrogance of a man who had never been told no, he lunged. A brutal backhand sent Sarah sprawling against the cold tile floor. Her head hit the wall with a sickening thud, and for a second the world went grey. Julian didn't stop. He pinned her down, his hand wrapping around her throat, squeezing the very breath she used to defy him. "You're going to be erased," he whispered, his eyes wide and manic. "You and your little charity cases. You're nothing." What Julian Vane didn't know was that 10 feet away in the deep shadows of a recessed alcove, a ghost was watching. Elias Thorne stood perfectly still. His hand gripped the handle of his mop bucket so hard the plastic began to groan and whiten. In that moment, the 60-year-old janitor with the limp felt something inside his chest crack open. The penance, the silence, the 20 years of being a doormat. It all evaporated. The janitor died in that hallway, and the architect returned. He didn't scream, he didn't run. He moved with a terrifying silent fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his age. He stepped out of the shadows, just as Julian raised his hand to strike Sarah again. When Julian felt a hand on his shoulder, he expected a security guard or perhaps a fellow doctor he could intimidate. Instead, he felt a grip that felt like a hydraulic press, cold and unbreakable. He turned, a snarl forming on his lips, ready to bark a command at whoever dared touch him. But the words died in his throat. He was looking into the eyes of the old man who cleaned the toilets. But they weren't the eyes of a janitor. They were the eyes of a man who had seen 1,000 deaths and hadn't blinked at a single one of them. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Elias didn't say a word at first. He simply stood there, his posture shifting, his shoulders squaring, his presence expanding until he seemed to fill the entire corridor. "Take your hand off her," Elias said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, gravelly rasp, a sound that carried the weight of a tombstone. Julian, trying to regain his composure, let out a nervous, jagged laugh. "Do you have any idea who I am, you old freak? My father is Arthur Vane. You're fired. You're done. Get your filthy hands off me before I have you arrested." Elias didn't flinch. He leaned in closer until Julian could smell the faint scent of industrial soap and old tobacco. He leaned in until their foreheads almost touched. "I know exactly who your father is, Julian," Elias whispered, "and I know that he owes a very large debt to a man named Lorenzo Moretti. I know about the offshore accounts in the Caymans that were used to pay for your residency. And I know that if I make one phone call, your father's blue wall won't be able to protect you from the people he's been stealing from." The color drained from Julian's face. The name Moretti was a death sentence in the Chicago underworld, a name no janitor, no matter how long he had worked there, should ever know. Julian's hand slipped from Sarah's throat. He stumbled back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Elias ignored him. He knelt down beside Sarah, his touch suddenly as gentle as a father's. He helped her sit up, checking the bruise forming on her temple. "Are you all right, Doc?" he asked, his voice returning to the quiet tone he used when they shared coffee at 4 News AM. But when he looked back at Julian, the gentleness vanished. "Go," Elias commanded. "Run to your father. Tell him everything. Tell him the shadow is back." Julian didn't wait. He scrambled to his feet and sprinted down the hallway, the sound of his expensive leather shoes echoing like a heartbeat against the tile. Sarah looked up at Elias, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and pure, unadulterated terror. She saw the man she thought she knew, but she also saw the tattoos peeking out from under his rolled-up sleeves, dark, intricate patterns of a life lived in the mouth of the beast. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. Who are you?" Elias looked at the silver medal of St. Jude lying on the floor, having fallen from his pocket during the movement. He picked it up, rubbing the tarnished surface with his thumb. "I'm a man who's done being a ghost, Sarah," he said, his eyes fixed on the darkness where Julian had disappeared. "And I think it's time we finally cleaned this place up." But as the morning sun began to bleed through the Chicago clouds, Elias knew that his return wouldn't be without a price. By the time the shift change happened, the system began to strike back. Before the clock struck 8, Sarah was escorted from the building, suspended on trumped-up charges of stealing narcotics. Elias's locker was found cut open, his few belongings tossed into the trash, and a security detail was waiting to escort him off the property. Arthur Vane thought he had won. He thought he was dealing with a lowly doctor and a senile cleaner. He didn't realize that he had just poked a sleeping dragon that knew where every body in Chicago was buried. The architect was home, and he was about to build a house of cards that the Vane family would never escape. But this was only the beginning of the storm. The grey slush of Chicago felt colder than usual against Sarah Miller's boots as she stood on the sidewalk outside St. Jude's Memorial, her hands trembling as they clutched a cardboard box filled with the meager remains of her professional life. Only an hour ago, she had been a doctor with a future, a woman dedicated to the pulse of the city's most vulnerable. Now she was a pariah. The official notice of her suspension burned like a brand in her pocket. The words, "narcotics theft" and "unprofessional conduct," etched into the paper with the surgical precision of a lie designed to kill. But the nightmare had only just begun. As the automatic doors of the hospital hissed shut behind her, Sarah felt as if she were being erased from existence. The security guards, men she had greeted with a smile every morning for a year, wouldn't even look her in the eye. They stood like statues, a human wall protecting the kingdom of Arthur Vane. This is how the system works when you challenge the gods. It doesn't just defeat you, it rewrites your history until you become the villain of your own story. I want you to think about a time when you were right, but the world told you that you were wrong. How did that silence feel? As we delve deeper into the transformation of Elias Thorne, remember that justice often hides in the places we refuse to look. Please, stay with me until the very end of this chapter, because the moves Elias makes next will change everything you think you know about power. Tell me in the comments, on a scale of 0 to 10, how much you despise a system that protects the guilty. And if you believe that everyone deserves a defender like Elias, subscribe to the channel and join our community. I'm glad you're here. Across town, in a cramped one-bedroom apartment that smelled of linoleum and regret, Elias Thorne sat at a small wooden table. He was looking at his hands. They were the hands of a janitor, calloused, stained by chemicals, and etched with the fine lines of age. But as he flexed them, the tremors of the old man disappeared. The strength that had pinned Julian Vane against the hospital wall was still there, coiled like a snake beneath the skin. He had been fired, of course. His locker had been pried open, his few personal belongings dumped into a trash bag, as if his 20 years of service meant nothing. Arthur Vane had personally overseen the process, standing in the doorway of the maintenance closet with a look of bored contempt. Vane hadn't even spoken to him. He had simply gestured for the security guards to finish the job. To Arthur Vane, Elias was a broken tool, a nuisance to be discarded. He didn't see the man who had once calculated the profit margins of an entire city's vice. He didn't see the architect, but Elias saw everything. He saw the way Arthur's expensive silk tie didn't quite hide the pulse thrumming in his neck. He saw the way Julian lurked in the background, his face a mask of bruised ego and lingering fear. The Vanes thought they had ended the problem by removing the players from the board. They didn't realize that Elias Thorne didn't play by the board's rules. He had built the board. The internal conflict was a physical ache in Elias's chest. For 20 years, He had lived by a vow. He had promised the memory of his daughter that he would never again walk into the dark. He had convinced himself that by cleaning floors, he was washing away the blood of his past. But as he thought of Sarah Miller, her career ruined, her reputation shattered, and the boy Leo, who was now essentially a death row inmate in a pediatric ward because his insurance didn't match the hospital's bottom line, Elias realized that his silence wasn't penance. It was cowardice. "Forgive me, Maria," he whispered to the empty room, the name of his daughter a ghost on his lips. He reached into a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of his closet and pulled out a small, leather-bound book and a burner phone that had remained dark for 2 decades. The turning point came at 11:00 p.m. Elias didn't go to the police. He didn't go to the press. He knew the Vanes owned the headlines and the badges. Instead, he put on a heavy charcoal overcoat, pulled a flat cap low over his eyes, and caught a bus toward Cicero. The neighborhood hadn't changed much in 20 years. It was still a place of brick 2 flats and neon signs that flickered like dying stars. He stopped in front of a nondescript building with blacked-out windows and a sign that simply read, "The Social Club." 2 men stood by the door, young, thick-necked, and wearing the arrogance of soldiers who had never seen a real war. They looked at the old man with the limp and laughed. "Lost, Grandpa? The bingo hall is 3 blocks over," one of them sneered, stepping into Elias's path. Elias didn't stop walking. He didn't even look up. "Tell Benny that the man who built his father's house is standing on his doorstep. And tell him that if he makes me wait, I'll start charging interest on the debt." The soldiers froze. There was something in Elias's voice, a vibration of pure, unadulterated authority, that bypassed their bravado and hit their survival instincts. One of them disappeared inside. A minute later, the door swung wide. The interior of the club was a time capsule of mahogany and expensive cigars. In a booth at the far back sat Benny the Bull Moretti, the current head of the Cicero faction and the son of the man Elias had served decades ago. Benny was a man of expensive suits and cheap morals, but he wasn't a fool. When he saw Elias Thorne walk through the door, he didn't rise to greet him. He sat perfectly still, his glass of scotch halfway to his lips. "They told me you were dead, Architect," Benny said, his voice a mixture of awe and suspicion. "They said you went into the ground the same day as your girl." "I stayed in the shadows, Benny. It was quieter there," Elias replied, sliding into the booth without being asked. The younger soldiers in the room watched with bated breath. Nobody spoke to Benny like that, nobody. "What brings a legend out of retirement?" Benny asked, leaning forward. "You want back in? The city's changed. It's all digital now. Encryption, crypto, ghost accounts. We could use a mind like yours." "I don't want back in," Elias said, his eyes like flint. "I want the ledger on Arthur Vane. I know your father kept a record of every bribe, every land deal, and every donation Vane used to fund his hospital expansion. I know Vane is currently washing money for the syndicate's construction arm. I want the proof." Benny laughed, but it was a dry, nervous sound. "Vane is a protected asset, Elias. He's the bridge between the high-rises and the gutters. Why would I give you the keys to his kingdom?" Elias leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a level that only Benny could hear. "Because if you don't, I'll go to the feds with the location of the 3 bodies buried under the foundation of the new terminal at O'Hare. The ones your father put there, the ones you helped move when you were 19 and trying to prove how tough you were." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man's spirit. Benny's face went pale. He realized in that moment that Elias Thorne hadn't come to ask for a favor. He had come to collect a soul. "You're playing a dangerous game, Architect," Benny whispered. "Vane isn't just a man. He's a system. You pull one thread, and the whole city might unravel." "Then let it unravel," Elias said, standing up. "I've spent 20 years cleaning up other people's messes. Tonight, I'm the one making the mess." 10 minutes later, Elias walked out of the club with the encrypted USB drive and a folder of documents that Arthur Vane thought had been incinerated years ago. But Elias wasn't done. He knew that information was a scalpel, and he needed to perform a very specific kind of surgery. He began to move through the city like a ghost. He visited a small private printing shop owned by a man who owed him a life. He made a series of phone calls to numbers that shouldn't have been in service. And then he began the psychological warfare. Arthur Vane returned home that night to find a single specific brand of cigar sitting on his mahogany desk. It was the brand he only smoked with his mistress, a woman his wife knew nothing about. There was no note, just the cigar. Julian Vane woke up the next morning to find a single spent shell casing sitting on his pillow, right next to his head. He screamed for his father, but the security team found no signs of forced entry. The blue wall was intact, yet someone had walked right through it. The message was clear. I am in your house. I know your sins, and I am coming for your legacy. Elias, meanwhile, met Sarah in a quiet park on the south side. The wind was whipping off the lake, and Sarah looked smaller than he remembered, her spirit flagging under the weight of the false accusations. They're going to take my license, Elias, she said, her voice hollow. The hospital board meeting is in 3 days. They've already lined up witnesses to say I was erratic, that I was using. My life is over. Elias looked at her, and for a second the architect disappeared, replaced by the man who had pushed a mop for 20 years just to stay close to the light. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. The board meeting is a stage, Sarah, he said softly. Arthur Vane thinks he's the director, but he's just an actor who forgot his lines. I need you to hold on for 3 more days. Can you do that for me? Can you stay strong for Leo? Sarah looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the coldness of a dangerous man, it was the fierce, burning resolve of a protector. Who are you really, Elias? I'm the man who cleans up the trash, Sarah, he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. And I've just found a lot of it. As Elias walked away, his limp seemed less pronounced. The weight of his past was no longer a burden. It was a weapon. He had the ledger, he had the leverage, and he had the will. But Arthur Vane was a cornered rat, and a rat with a hospital's worth of resources and a city's worth of corrupt cops was still a deadly threat. The game of chess had begun, and Elias Thorne had just taken the first pawn. But in the shadows of the hospital, Arthur Vane was already making his own moves, moves that would target the only thing Elias had left to lose. The architect was back, but he was about to find out that when you burn down a kingdom, you have to be careful not to let the fire consume the very people you're trying to save. He's being moved, Elias. They're taking him to a county hospice in the morning, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the payphone. She was standing in a rain-slicked booth 3 blocks from the hospital, the neon sign of a nearby diner, casting a sickly yellow glow over her pale face. They say it's for resource optimization, but we both know what it is. Without the surgery, Leo won't last a week in a place like that. Arthur Vane is killing a child just to prove he can. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, a vacuum that seemed to suck the warmth out of the air. Elias Thorne sat in the darkness of a basement workshop, the only light coming from the glowing screen of a laptop he hadn't touched in 20 years. The USB drive he had taken from Benny Moretti was plugged in, its contents a digital graveyard of every sin Arthur Vane had ever committed. But numbers on a spreadsheet weren't enough to stop a transfer order. They weren't enough to save a boy's heart. Go home, Sarah, Elias said, his voice as cold and steady as the Chicago winter. Don't go near the hospital. Don't answer your door for anyone you don't know. The Vanes are cornered, and a cornered man doesn't care who he crushes. I need you to trust me for 12 more hours. 12 hours? Elias, the board meeting is tomorrow night. The Founders' Gala is the only thing they care about. After that, the new expansion is approved, and they'll have enough power to bury us forever. I know, Elias replied. That's why I'm going to be there. Now go home. He hung up the phone and looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the laptop screen. He saw the janitor, the tired eyes, the graying hair, the humble posture, but beneath that, he saw the architect. He saw the man who had once designed the very systems that kept men like Arthur Vane in power. For 20 years, he had tried to outrun his shadow, believing that if he cleaned enough floors, he would eventually be pure. But as he looked at the data on the screen, the bribes, the kickbacks, the lives discarded like medical waste, he realized that you can't wash away a bloody past. You can only use the blood you have left to paint a different future. I want you to stay with me as the clock ticks down to the final confrontation. We are about to see what happens when a man who has nothing left to lose decides to burn down the world to save one innocent life. If you've ever felt like a small voice screaming against a brick wall, this next part is for you. Tell me in the comments from 0 to 10 how much you believe in the power of the truth. And if you're ready to see the veins fall, subscribe and hit that notification bell. I'm honored to have you here. The situation worsened as the sun began to set over the jagged skyline. Arthur Vane wasn't just a corrupt administrator. He was a man who understood the blue wall of hospital security better than anyone. By 6 p.m., a memo had been circulated to every entrance of St. Jude's. Elias Thorne and Sarah Miller were listed as threats to patient safety. Their photos were pinned at the security desks, and the private security force, men with the eyes of soldiers and the hearts of mercenaries, were told to use any means necessary to keep them off the property. Arthur Vane was also moving the trash. He had ordered a complete wipe of the server room in the restricted wing. He thought he had deleted the footage of Julian's assault on Sarah. He thought he had erased the evidence of the falsified surgical reports. He sat in his mahogany-paneled office, sipping a 20-year-old scotch, watching the snow begin to fall outside. He felt untouchable. He had the police in his pocket, the board in his hand, and the city's elite arriving in 3 hours for the gala. But Elias Thorne was already inside. He didn't use the front doors. He didn't use the staff entrance. He knew the hospital's blueprints better than the architects who had drawn them. He knew about the steam tunnels that ran beneath the oncology wing, the hidden maintenance shafts that connected the laundry room to the executive suites, and the forgotten crawl spaces where the old pipes groaned like ghosts. As he moved through the darkness of the tunnels, his limp was gone. The adrenaline and the sheer, focused intent of the architect had overridden the physical decay of 20 years of labor. He felt the darkness creeping back in, the old familiar coldness that had once made him a king of the underworld. He hated it. He hated the way his mind automatically calculated the most efficient way to break a man's neck or the precise timing needed to bypass a motion sensor. Every step he took toward justice felt like a step back toward the monster he had been. Is this the price? He wondered, his breath hitching in the damp air of the tunnels. To save Sarah, do I have to become the man who broke my daughter's heart? He stopped in a small alcove near the main server hub, his hand brushing against the tarnished St. Jude medal in his pocket. He remembered his daughter's face, the way she had looked at him before the world went black. She had seen the architect and she had been afraid. He didn't want Sarah to see that man. He didn't want the world to remember him as a ghost of the outfit. But as he heard the heavy boots of the security team patrolling the floor above him, he knew he didn't have a choice. The turning point came at 8:30 p.m. Elias had reached the auxiliary server room, a place Arthur Vane had forgotten about. It was a dusty, cramped room, filled with legacy hardware from a decade ago. It was here that the ghost logs were kept, the automatic backups that the modern system didn't even recognize. Elias's fingers flew over the keyboard. He wasn't looking for financial records anymore. He was looking for the one thing Arthur Vane thought he had successfully incinerated, and then he found it. The footage wasn't just of the assault. The camera in the restricted wing had been positioned at a high angle, capturing not just Julian's brutal backhand, but something far more damning. The video showed Arthur Vane arriving 10 minutes later. It showed the director looking at his son, looking at the unconscious doctor on the floor, and then calmly walking over to the security console and hitting the delete sequence. It showed Arthur Vane coaching his son on what to say, his face a mask of cold, calculating evil, as he stepped over Sarah Miller as if she were a piece of litter. Elias felt a rage so pure it threatened to consume his vision. It wasn't just a cover-up. It was a total disregard for human life. "You think you're a god, Arthur," Elias whispered, the light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes like a predatory fire. "But gods don't hide in the shadows. Men do." He began the upload. It wasn't a fast process. The legacy hardware groaned under the weight of the high-definition files. Outside the room he could hear the muffled sounds of the gala beginning, the clinking of champagne glasses, the swell of a string quartet, the laughter of the people who funded Arthur Vane's empire. They were all there, dressed in their finest silks and furs, celebrating a man who was currently planning the death of a foster child and the destruction of a dedicated doctor. Elias checked his watch. The Founders' Gala was about to reach its peak. Arthur Vane would take the stage to announce the expansion. He would talk about legacy and healing and community. But the architect had a different presentation in mind. He pulled a small tablet from his heavy coat, a device he had modified with a high-gain transmitter. He had one shot at this. If the security team found him before the upload was complete, he would be buried in the foundations of the hospital, and the truth would die with him. Suddenly, the door handle of the server room rattled. "Hey, who's in there? This wing is off limits," a voice barked from the hallway. It was one of the Vane's private security guards. Elias didn't panic. He didn't move. He watched the progress bar on the screen. 88%, 89%, 90%. The guard began to kick at the door, the heavy wood splintering under the force. Elias looked around the room. He had no weapon. He had no way out. He looked at the mop bucket he had left in the corner, a symbol of the life he had tried to live. He reached out and grabbed the heavy, industrial handle. "I'm just the janitor," Elias whispered to himself, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. "And it's time to take out the trash." The door burst open. A mountain of a man in a black tactical vest stepped into the room, his hand already reaching for the stun gun at his hip. He saw the old man standing by the servers, looking small and fragile in the dim light. "Step away from the console, old man," the guard shouted, stepping forward with the confidence of a predator. Elias didn't step away. He smiled. It was a smile that hadn't been seen in Chicago for 20 years, a smile that had once made mob bosses tremble. "You're late," Elias said. As the guard lunged, Elias moved. It wasn't the movement of a 60-year-old man with a limp. It was a blur of calculated violence, a reminder that the architect didn't just build systems. He knew exactly where the structural weaknesses were. The gala was in full swing. Arthur Vane was adjusting his tie in the mirror of the ballroom's green room, ready to walk out and claim his victory. He had no idea that beneath his feet, the foundations of his world were already beginning to crumble. The architect was back, and he was finally ready to finish the job. The grand ballroom of St. Jude's Memorial was a sea of shimmering silk, expensive cologne, and the hollow laughter of people who believed they were untouchable. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the assembly of Chicago's elite, senators, developers, and high-ranking police officials, all gathered to celebrate the visionary leadership of Arthur Vane. On the stage, a podium made of polished mahogany stood waiting for the man of the hour. Arthur Vane adjusted his cufflinks, a shark-like smile playing on his lips as he looked out at the kingdom he had built on a foundation of secrets and silenced voices. Beside him stood Julian, looking every bit the heir apparent in a tailored tuxedo. The bruise on his ego had been masked by the arrogance of knowing that his father had handled the doctor and the janitor. To them, the storm had passed. They didn't realize that the real storm had just walked into the room. But this was only the beginning. As the string quartet faded and Arthur Vane stepped up to the microphone, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open. The security guards, distracted by the prestige of the event, didn't notice the man in the navy blue janitor's shirt walking down the center aisle. He didn't have a tuxedo. He didn't have an invitation. But he walked with the authority of a man who owned every brick in the building. "I need you to stay with me for these final moments, because the scales of justice are about to be balanced in a way this city will never forget. This is the moment where the nobody becomes the judge. Please, watch until the very last second to see where Elias Thorne ends up. And when we're done, tell me in the comments from 0 to 10 if you think Arthur Vane got what he deserved. If you believe that the truth is the most powerful weapon in the world, subscribe to the channel right now. Your support is what allows these stories to be told." Arthur Vane cleared his throat, his voice booming through the high-fidelity speakers. "Tonight we celebrate progress. We celebrate the expansion of St. Jude's, a beacon of hope for all of Chicago. We believe that every life has value, and that our legacy is defined by the care we provide." Suddenly, the massive LED screens behind Arthur flickered. The promotional video of smiling nurses and shiny new wings vanished, replaced by a grainy, high-angle security feed. The room went silent. The clinking of champagne glasses stopped as the image of Dr. Sarah Miller appeared on the screen. The elite of Chicago watched in stunned horror as Julian Vane lunged across the frame, his hand striking the young doctor with a brutal force that made the audience gasp. "What is this? Turn this off," Arthur shouted, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the velvet curtains. He signaled frantically to the AV booth, but the booth was locked from the inside. Elias Thorne had ensured that. The video didn't stop. It played the aftermath. The moment Arthur Vane himself walked into the frame, the room watched as the hospital director looked at the unconscious woman on the floor and then calmly coached his son on how to lie. They saw him delete the files. They saw the cold, calculated erasure of a human being's life for the sake of a reputation. But then the audio changed. A low, gravelly rasp filled the ballroom, a voice that carried the weight of 20 years of silence. It was Elias. "October 14th, the voice began. "Account number 4492 in the Grand Cayman branch. A deposit of $200,000 from the Moretti construction firm. The price for overlooking the structural defects in the new pediatric wing." Arthur Vane froze. His breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't just a video of an assault. This was the ledger. "November 2nd, Elias continued, his voice echoing like a death sentence. "A bribe paid to the chief of medicine to ignore the mortality rates in Julian Vane's surgical unit. 6 patients dead. 6 families told it was unavoidable complications." Elias Thorne reached the foot of the stage. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had rolled up his sleeves, exposing the dark, intricate tattoos of the Chicago outfit, the marks of the architect. The police officers in the room, men who knew the history of the city's underworld, felt a chill run down their spines. They recognized those marks. They realized they weren't looking at a janitor. They were looking at a ghost who had returned to claim his due. Julian, panicked and cornered, tried to lung at Elias, screaming about his father's power. Elias didn't even flinch. He caught Julian's wrist with a grip that made the younger man drop to his knees in agony. "You told Sarah she was a nobody from the slums," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow reached every corner of the silent room. "You told her she would be erased, but in this city the only things that get erased are the things that don't have a foundation. And your foundation is rot." Arthur Vane stepped back from the podium, his eyes wide with terror. "Who are you? What do you want? Money? I can give you millions." Elias looked at the silver St. Jude medal in his hand, the tarnished metal gleaming under the chandeliers. He tossed it onto the podium where it landed with a heavy final thud. "I don't want your money, Arthur," Elias said. "I'm the man who cleans up the trash, and tonight the trash is you." The blue wall didn't just crack, it disintegrated. The police officers in the ballroom, realizing the evidence was now public and undeniable, were forced to act. They moved in, not to protect the Vanes, but to arrest them. Julian was handcuffed in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Arthur was led away in his $5,000 tuxedo, his legacy incinerated in the span of 10 minutes. But the real victory wasn't in the arrests. It was in what happened next. The nurses, the orderlies, and the junior residents, the people who had watched Elias push a mop for years, began to clap. It started as a ripple and grew into a roar. They weren't just clapping for the downfall of a tyrant. They were clapping for the man who had stood up for them when they were too afraid to speak. The aftermath was a whirlwind of restoration. With the Vanes removed, the hospital board was dissolved and replaced by an interim committee. Sarah Miller was not only reinstated, but promoted to chief resident of pediatrics. The charges against her were dropped, and the truth of her bravery became a legend in the South Side. And Leo, the uninsured foster kid, received his heart surgery 2 days later. It was performed by the best surgeon in the city, funded by an anonymous donation that appeared in the hospital's accounts the morning after the gala, a donation that looked suspiciously like the exact amount of Arthur Vane's offshore balance. Sarah looked for Elias for weeks. She went to his apartment, but it was empty, the linoleum floors polished to a mirror shine. She went to the maintenance closet, but his navy blue jumpsuit was hanging neatly on a hook, his name tag removed. He hadn't stayed for the applause. He knew that by revealing the architect, he had ended the peace he had worked 20 years to find. The outfit knew he was alive. The ghosts were no longer silent. 6 months later, in a small, sun-drenched town in Nevada, A man works as a gardener for a public park. He moves with a slight limp, but his eyes are clear and free of the shadows that once haunted them. He spends his days tending to roses and oak trees, finding a different kind of penance in growth rather than cleaning. One afternoon, he receives a letter. There is no return address, only a photo inside. It's a picture of a young boy named Leo, wearing a superhero cape and running through a playground, a bright, healthy smile on his face. Behind him stands Sarah Miller, looking tired but happy, a stethoscope around her neck and the light of hope in her eyes. On the back of the photo, a single sentence is written: "The foundation is strong, thank you." Elias Thorne smiles, the first true smile he has felt in decades. He tucks the photo into his pocket, right next to a brand new silver St. Jude medal. He realized that you can't wash away a bloody past with a mop, but you can balance the scales by protecting the future. He is no longer a ghost, and he is no longer the architect of crime. He is a man who realized that true power isn't found in the money you steal or the titles you hold. It's found in the courage to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. Justice may be blind, and she may have a long memory, but sometimes, when the world gets too dirty, she carries a mop. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that no one is too small to make a difference, then please subscribe to the channel. I promise to bring you more stories of hidden heroes and the quiet power of the truth every single day. And don't forget to tell me in the comments, from 0 to 10, what you thought of Elias's journey. I read every single one. Thank you for being here. And remember, even in the darkest shadows, there is always a light waiting to be found. See you in the next story.